In the Victorian era, asylums were places of both hope and despair. Patients endured treatments that were often more harmful than helpful, all under the guise of medical progress. This is that story. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and antiseptic. In a long corridor, cold tiles echoed under bare feet as women shuffled from cell to cell, their eyes cast downward. Beyond the bars, a nurse moved steadily along, her face hidden by shadow, holding a tray of meagre rations. Each door clanged shut behind her with an ominous finality, sealing in whispers and sobs that mingled with the dripping water from the stone walls. In the dimly lit room, cold stone walls encased the women in darkness, broken only by flickering candlelight that cast long shadows across their gaunt faces. Their eyes, wide and hollow, reflected the harsh treatments they endured, doused with icy water, shackled to beds, bled of supposed toxins. A doctor moved through them, his face stern beneath a hat, his movements precise but coldly efficient, believing in progress despite the suffering he wrought. Beyond the cells, a courtyard offered a glimpse of sky, though it was often too cold to venture out. Women wrapped in thin shawls shuffled along the cobblestones, their breath visible in the chill air. The sound of dripping water from the stone walls mingled with distant cries and hushed whispers. A nurse moved through them, her steps deliberate but silent, holding a ledger that listed treatments and confinement times with clinical precision. The sound of a key turning in a lock echoed through the narrow hallway, followed by the soft scuffling of feet. In one cell, a woman huddled against the cold stone wall, her breath visible in the frigid air. A nurse entered with a tray bearing a bowl of thin gruel and a cup of tepid water. The woman's eyes darted to the door as it creaked shut behind the nurse, who moved on without a word, leaving the cell silent except for the woman shivering. The sound of a key turning in the lock echoed through the narrow hallway, followed by the soft shuffling of feet. In one cell, a woman huddled against the cold stone wall, her breath visible in the frigid air. A nurse entered with a tray bearing a bowl of thin gruel and a cup of tepid water. The woman's eyes darted to the door as it creaked shut behind the nurse, who moved on without a word, leaving the cell silent except for the woman shivering. The stone walls seemed to close in around her, amplifying every sound and feeling of isolation. The courtyard offered a glimpse of sky, though its grey-blue expanse brought little comfort. Women in thin shawls shuffled along cobblestones, their breath visible in the chill air. Dripping water from stone walls echoed through the enclosure, mingling with distant cries and hushed whispers. A nurse moved silently among them, her steps precise, holding a ledger that listed treatments and confinement times with clinical precision. The air was thick with the scent of medicinal herbs and damp stone. A woman sat on a wooden bench, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the ground. Around her, other inmates moved silently, their faces pale beneath the dim light. A doctor approached, his footsteps echoing off the walls. He carried a leather-bound book, flipping through pages with clinical detachment, as if the suffering before him was merely data to be recorded. The faint glow of a flickering oil lamp illuminated the stark, cold walls of the cell. Shadows danced across the stone floor as a woman huddled in a corner, her thin shawl barely shielding her from the biting chill. Her eyes, wide with fear and confusion, darted to the door as it creaked open. A nurse entered silently, placing a tray on a wooden bench. The bowl of gruel was cold, the water tepid at best. The woman's breath misted in the air, her body trembling uncontrollably. The courtyard was a prison within itself, the walls pressing in like cold hands. Women moved silently over cobblestones, their faces lost beneath shawls pulled tight against the biting chill. Dripping water from stone ledges echoed through the enclosure, mixing with the soft rustle of thin fabric and distant whispers. A nurse moved among them, her ledger held tightly, recording every movement and cry with clinical detachment. The heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway lined with cells. Each cell contained women huddled in corners, their eyes fixed on the newcomer, a doctor holding a clipboard and a stern expression. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and unwashed bodies. The doctor's footsteps echoed off the walls as he approached each cell, pausing briefly to scribble notes into his ledger without ever making eye contact. Inside one cell, a woman's voice broke the silence, pleading for warmth and comfort. but her words were lost in the cold indifference of the institution. The hallway stretched before them like a shadowed tunnel, lined with small cells where women huddled against the biting chill. Each cell was a world apart, filled with silent figures wrapped in thin shawls. A nurse moved silently down the corridor, her ledger held tightly under her arm. Her steps echoed off the stone walls, mingling with distant cries and whispers. The air was thick with desperation and cold. The courtyard's chill seeped into bones, a constant reminder of confinement. Women moved in silent procession, their shawls barely shielding against the biting cold. A nurse, her face obscured by shadow, moved among them with a ledger clutched tightly under one arm, recording every cry and movement with clinical detachment. The air was thick with desperation, each breath misting in the frigid air. Stone walls loomed above, pressing in like cold hands. The sound of dripping water echoed through the narrow hallway, a steady rhythm against stone. In one cell, a woman rocked back and forth, her thin shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes were sunken, haunted by unseen terrors. A nurse approached with a tray, placing it just outside the cell door without a word. The bowl of gruel was cold, the water barely warmer than the air. The woman's breath misted in the chill as she reached for the food, her hands trembling. The air was thick with the scent of medicinal herbs and unwashed bodies. In a cell, a woman sat huddled against the stone wall, her eyes vacant as she stared at the flickering candlelight. A nurse entered silently, holding a basin of cold water and a rough cloth. She approached without a word, her movements clinical and efficient. The woman flinched as the cold cloth touched her skin, but made no sound. The nurse's ledger was open in one hand, recording every detail with meticulous care. The courtyard was a gauntlet of silence and stone. Women shuffled along, shawls barely shielding them from the biting chill. A nurse moved through them, ledger open under one arm, recording every cry and movement with clinical detachment. Her face was obscured by shadow, her movements precise and cold. One woman's breath misted in the frigid air as the smell of wet stone and linseed oil filled the room. A woman sat on a wooden bench, her fingers tracing the rough grain as she watched the nurse fill a syringe with murky liquid from an unlabeled bottle. The nurse's hands moved with practiced precision, each motion recorded in her ledger before administering the concoction. The woman swallowed hard, her eyes wide and fearful, but made no sound. The candlelight flickered, casting shadows that danced along the stone walls. Shadows danced along the stone walls as the flickering oil lamps cast eerie light across the ward. A woman sat on a rough-hewn bench, her hands clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. The nurse moved silently through the room, recording every detail in her ledger with clinical detachment. Cold seeped from the stone floor into her bones, each breath misting in the chill air as she stared vacantly at the dim light. The metallic tang of unwashed skin filled the air. In a dimly lit cell, shadows clung to the stone walls like damp nightclothes. A woman hunched over, her hands gripping the cold iron bars, eyes fixed on the nurse approaching with a wooden tray. The nurse's steps echoed softly against the floor, each movement noted in her ledger before she placed the tray down and retreated as quickly as she had come. The woman watched, unblinking, as the candlelight flickered across her gaunt face. The clink of metal against stone echoed through the ward. A woman sat motionless on a cold bench, her eyes fixed on the nurse who approached with chains in hand. The nurse's movements were mechanical, each step and gesture recorded meticulously in her ledger before securing the restraints around the woman's wrists. The chill air bit into exposed skin, and the woman shivered, her breath visible in the dim light cast by oil lamps. The ward smelled of damp earth and unwashed bodies. A woman sat still on a wooden bench, her gaze fixed on the nurse who moved with mechanical precision through the room. Each step echoed softly against the stone floor as the nurse recorded details in her ledger. The oil lamps cast flickering light across the gaunt faces of other patients, their eyes vacant and distant. Cold seeped from the stone into every part of her body, making each breath a thin mist before her lips. The stone walls of the ward seemed to close in, pressing down with an unyielding chill. A woman huddled near a flickering oil lamp, her breath misting in the cold air. Shadows played along the floor as she watched the nurse move through the room, each step recorded in the ledger with clinical detachment. The silence was broken only by the occasional creak of wood and the distant murmur of other inmates. The woman's hands trembled slightly, gripping the rough fabric of her shawl for comfort. The distant murmur of patients drifted through the air, mingling with the scent of unwashed bodies and damp earth. A woman sat huddled on a rough bench, her gaze fixed on the cold stone floor as she wrapped her shawl tighter around herself. Shadows danced along the walls as oil lamps cast flickering light across the gaunt faces of other inmates. The nurse moved through the room with mechanical precision, each step echoing softly against the stone floor and recorded in her ledger with clinical detachment. Each breath misted before her lips, the chill seeping into every fibre of her being. A woman's voice whispered in the corner, a soft echo against the cold stone. Oil lamps cast eerie shadows on the rough-hewn walls where damp seeped through the cracks. The nurse moved silently along the rows of beds, her ledger clutched tightly in one hand. Each patient lay still under thin blankets, their eyes vacant and unseeing. The air was thick with a chill that crept into bones, each breath visible in the dim light. The rustle of paper filled the air as the nurse noted each patient's condition, her pen scratching against the ledger. A woman lay on a narrow cot, eyes closed, wrapped in layers of thin fabric that offered little warmth. Shadows danced along the walls from the flickering oil lamps, casting an eerie glow over the cold stone floor. The chill permeated everything, seeping into bones and lungs with each shuddering breath. The metallic clink of keys echoed through the ward as the nurse unlocked a door leading to the cold bathroom. Patients watched with hollow eyes as she ushered in one woman after another, their bodies shivering even before they entered the frigid water. The oil lamps flickered weakly against the damp walls, casting long shadows that danced along the stone floor. Each breath from the patients misted in the air like smoke from a dying fire. The cold was an ever-present spectre, seeping into every corner of the ward. Oil lamps flickered weakly against damp walls, casting long shadows that danced along the stone floor. A woman lay on a narrow cot, her eyes closed, wrapped in layers of thin fabric that offered little warmth. Each breath misted before her lips, like smoke from a dying fire. The nurse moved through the room with mechanical precision, her ledger clutched tightly as she noted each patient's condition with clinical detachment. The distant clatter of metal echoed through the ward, mingling with the soft rustle of fabric as patients stirred in their sleep. A nurse moved silently along the rows, her ledger clutched tightly, noting each shiver and sigh with clinical precision. Shadows flickered across the stone floor from the weak oil lamps, casting an eerie glow over the gaunt faces of inmates huddled under thin blankets. Each breath misted before lips, the chill seeping into every fibre of their being. The soft creak of wooden floors echoed as the nurse moved between rows of beds. A patient stirred, eyes fluttering open to reveal a world dimmed by flickering oil lamps and shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the cold stone walls. Each breath was a visible mist in the frigid air, mingling with the faint scent of damp fabric and unwashed bodies. The nurse noted down each shiver and sigh, her movements clinical and precise, as if detached from the human suffering around her. The oil lamps cast a faint glow over the stone walls, barely reaching into the corners where shadows lingered. A patient stirred, her breath misting before her lips as she clung to thin blankets. The nurse's ledger crackled softly with each page turned, her notes meticulous but detached. Each shiver and sigh was recorded without emotion, the cold seeping into every fibre of their being. The air smelled faintly of damp fabric and unwashed bodies, mingling with the musty scent of old stone. The scent of damp fabric and unwashed bodies lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of medicinal herbs. A patient's breath misted before her lips as she clutched at thin blankets, her eyes fixed on the flickering oil lamp above. Shadows danced across the stone walls, casting long fingers that stretched like claws over the narrow cots. The nurse moved silently between beds, her ledger crackling softly with each page turned, noting each shiver and sigh without emotion. The distant clatter of metal echoed through the ward, mingling with the soft rustle of fabric as patients stirred in their sleep. A patient's eyes fluttered open to reveal a world dimmed by flickering oil lamps and shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across cold stone walls. Each breath was a visible mist in the frigid air, mingling with the faint scent of damp fabric and unwashed bodies. The nurse moved silently between beds, her ledger crackling softly with each page turned, noting each shiver and sigh without emotion. A patient's eyes fluttered open to the cold stone walls, flickering oil lamps casting eerie shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the ward. Each breath was a visible mist in the frigid air, mingling with the faint scent of damp fabric and unwashed bodies. The nurse moved silently between beds, her ledger crackling softly with each page turned, noting each shiver and sigh without emotion, as if detached from the human suffering around her. The nurse's ledger rested on the bedside table, its pages yellowed and worn. Outside, a chill wind rattled the barred windows, carrying with it the distant cry of another patient. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and damp fabric, while shadows danced across the stone walls like restless spirits. The patient's fingers clenched at the thin blanket, her breath misting in the frigid air as she drifted between wakefulness and dreams. The nurse noted each movement without emotion, her movements precise and clinical. The sound of dripping water echoed off the stone walls, a constant reminder of the damp that seeped through every crevice. A patient's ragged cough punctuated the silence, breaking the stillness like distant thunder. The nurse moved along the rows of beds, her ledger in hand, noting each tremor and groan with clinical precision. Shadows twisted across the walls, casting an otherworldly glow over the ward where the cold seemed to seep into bones. The chill air seemed to grip everything in its grasp, even the flickering oil lamps that barely pierced the gloom. A patient's ragged breath mingled with the whispers of night, while shadows twisted and danced across cold stone walls like restless spirits. The nurse moved silently between beds, her movements precise but emotionless, as if detached from the human suffering around her. Each shiver and sigh was noted in her ledger, its pages yellowed and worn, a testament to countless nights spent in this frigid purgatory. The distant clang of metal echoed through the ward, a stark reminder of the asylum's harsh reality. A patient stirred in her sleep, her breath misting in the cold air. Shadows danced across the stone walls like restless spirits, while the nurse moved silently between beds, her ledger crackling softly with each page turned. Each shiver and sigh was noted without emotion, as if detached from the human suffering around her. The smell of unwashed bodies and damp fabric filled the air as a patient stirred, her fingers clutching at the thin blanket. Outside, the wind howled around the asylum's stone walls, carrying with it distant cries that echoed through the night. Shadows danced across the cold stone, flickering in the light of oil lamps. The nurse moved silently between beds, her ledger crackling softly as she noted each shiver and sigh without emotion, lost in the clinical precision of her task. The nurse's footsteps echoed softly on the stone floor as she moved down the ward, her ledger held tightly in hand. Each page crackled with a sound that seemed amplified by the silence. A patient moaned softly, their breath misting in the frigid air, while another clutched at their thin blanket, fingers trembling. The distant cries of others drifted through the barred windows, mingling with the cold wind. Shadows twisted across the walls, flickering in the dim light of oil lamps. The flicker of oil lamps cast long shadows across the ward, their light barely piercing the encroaching darkness. A patient's restless movements tugged at her thin nightgown, revealing pallid skin chilled by the relentless cold. The nurse moved with practiced precision, her ledger a constant companion. Each entry marked another moment in this ceaseless cycle of suffering and silence, where shadows whispered secrets to those who could hear them. The distant cries of another patient drifted through the ward, mingling with the faint smell of disinfectant and stale air. A thin stream of light from an oil lamp pulled on the floor, illuminating a single shadow that stretched across the cold stone. The nurse paused at one bed, her hand hovering over a ledger. She noted each shiver and sigh, her movements clinical yet detached, as if observing a study in suffering rather than human lives. A patient's thin nightgown clung to her body as she trembled under the cold sheets. The distant cries and moans of others mingled with the sound of wind scraping against stone. The nurse moved between beds, her ledger crackling softly with each entry, a clinical observer in this world of suffering. Shadows flickered across the walls, merging with the whispers of restless spirits. Each shiver and sigh was noted, Yet the nurse's face remained inscrutable, detached from the human drama unfolding around her. The cold seeped into the bones of each patient, their breath visible in the frigid air. A thin stream of light from an oil lamp cast a pool on the floor, its glow barely reaching the far end of the ward. The nurse's movements were precise and detached as she noted the shivers and sighs of those around her. Shadows danced across the walls, merging with the flickering light, while distant cries and moans echoed through the night. Each entry in her ledger marked another moment in this endless cycle of suffering. The oil lamp's flicker danced across the stone floor, casting eerie shadows that writhed like spectres. A patient's breath hitched in the cold air, a ghostly whisper against the silence. The nurse moved silently between beds, her ledger crackling softly with each entry. The ward smelled of antiseptic and despair, a chill that settled deep into bones. Each shiver, each sigh was noted dispassionately, another mark on the endless. The distant moans of the patients echoed through the cold stone walls, mingling with the creaking of old wood. A thin stream of light from an oil lamp illuminated the nurse's shadow as she moved between beds, her ledger in hand. Each shiver and sigh was noted with clinical precision, a stark contrast to the human suffering around her. The air was thick with antiseptic and despair, each breath visible in the frigid atmosphere. The scent of unwashed bodies mingled with the antiseptic fumes, a harsh blend that hung in the air. A patient's bare feet scraped against the cold stone floor as she moved restlessly under her thin blanket. The nurse's shadow loomed large on the wall, her ledger open to a fresh page. Each shiver and sigh was meticulously recorded, the flickering oil lamp casting an amber glow over the ward. In this place, suffering was quantified with clinical precision. The nurse's ledger crackled softly as she noted each shiver and sigh. A patient's breath caught in her throat, a fragile sound amidst the silence. The cold stone floor was damp underfoot, and the antiseptic smell mingled with unwashed bodies. Each entry marked another moment of suffering, recorded dispassionately in the flickering light. Shadows danced across the walls, merging with the oil lamp's glow, leaving much unspoken. The cold air bit at the nurse's cheeks as she moved through the ward, her ledger a constant companion. Each patient's shiver and sigh was noted with clinical precision, the flickering oil lamps casting long shadows that danced along the walls. The antiseptic smell mingled with the unwashed bodies, creating an oppressive atmosphere. A distant cough echoed off the stone walls, adding to the symphony of suffering. The nurse's movements were methodical, her expression unreadable in the dim light. The distant tick of a brass clock echoed through the ward, marking time with an unfeeling precision. A patient's restless movements caused her bed to creak softly in the stillness. The nurse's ledger crackled as she noted each entry, her movements almost mechanical under the dim light of oil lamps. Shadows danced across the walls, merging with the flickering glow, casting long and twisted shapes that mirrored the suffering within. Each shiver and sigh was a reminder of the cold stone beneath their feet, the antiseptic air heavy with despair. The creaking of wooden floors echoed as patients shifted restlessly under their thin blankets. Shadows danced across the walls, merging with the flickering oil lamplight. Each shiver and sigh was noted by the nurse, her movements mechanical in the oppressive cold. The antiseptic smell mixed with unwashed bodies, creating a heavy atmosphere that clung to every breath. In this place, suffering was meticulously recorded, each entry marking another moment of despair. The flickering oil lamp cast a pale glow across the ward, illuminating the faces of patients as they lay in restless slumber. A thin blanket clung to one figure, her breaths shallow and uneven. Shadows danced along the stone walls, merging with the dim light. Each shiver was noted by the nurse, her movements precise and mechanical. The antiseptic smell mingled with unwashed bodies, creating an oppressive atmosphere that lingered in every corner. The cold air settled into the bone-deep silence of the ward, where shadows played on stone walls under oil lamps. A patient's fingers twitched at the edge of a bed, her breaths shallow and uneven in the stillness. The nurse moved with practiced precision, her ledger crackling softly as she noted each shiver and sigh. Each entry marked another moment of suffering, recorded dispassionately beneath the antiseptic smell that mingled with unwashed bodies. The shadows danced along the walls, merging with the flickering light. The sound of distant footsteps echoed off stone walls as the nurse moved through the ward, her movements precise and mechanical under the dim light of flickering oil lamps. Each shiver and sigh was noted with clinical detachment, recorded in her ledger like a solemn dirge. The antiseptic smell mingled with unwashed bodies, creating an oppressive atmosphere that clung to every breath. Shadows danced along the walls, merging with the flickering glow, casting long and twisted shapes that mirrored the suffering within. The distant clatter of metal echoed as the nurse pushed a heavy cart filled with cold bath buckets. Each patient's movements were noted, their shivers and sighs recorded in meticulous detail under the dim light of flickering oil lamps. Shadows danced along the stone walls, merging with the antiseptic smell that mingled with unwashed bodies. The oppressive atmosphere clung to every breath, a testament to the relentless suffering within. The ledger crackled softly as the nurse turned another page, her pen moving with practiced precision. The cold seeped into every crevice of the ward, settling around the patients like a shroud. Shadows stretched along the walls, merging with the flickering oil lamps. Each sigh and shiver was recorded, marking moments of despair in meticulous detail. The antiseptic smell mingled with unwashed bodies, creating an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down on every breath. The cold seeped through stone walls as the nurse moved quietly between beds, her breath visible in the chill. Patients lay entwined with thin blankets, their faces lost to shadows. Each shiver was noted, recorded coldly in a ledger held beneath flickering oil lamps. The antiseptic smell mingled with unwashed bodies, an oppressive scent that clung to every breath. Shadows danced along walls, merging with the dim light, casting long and twisted shapes that mirrored the despair within. The flickering oil lamp cast a pale glow over the ward, illuminating the thin faces of patients huddled together. The air was thick with antiseptic and sweat as the nurse moved silently among them, her ledger always at hand. Each patient's shiver and sigh was meticulously recorded, their suffering captured in cold, clinical detail. Shadows danced along the walls, merging with the dim light, creating an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down on every breath. The sound of metal scraping against stone filled the air as the nurse adjusted a patient's restraints. Each movement was precise, her face hidden in shadow beneath the dim oil lamp. The cold seeped through the thin fabric of their nightgowns, and the antiseptic smell clung to every breath. Patients lay motionless on creaking beds, their shivers noted with clinical detachment by the nurse's pen. Shadows danced along the walls, merging with the flickering light. The night was heavy with silence, save for the occasional rattle of metal as restraints were adjusted. Patients lay on creaking beds, shivers tracing their bodies like whispers. Each movement was captured by the nurse's steady pen beneath flickering oil lamps. Shadows danced along stone walls, merging with the antiseptic smell that clung to unwashed bodies, creating an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down on every breath. The scent of damp stone and unwashed bodies filled the air, mingling with the acrid tang of antiseptic. Patients lay in silence, their forms barely discernible beneath thin blankets. Each shiver and muffled sigh was noted by the nurse's steady pen, her face obscured by shadow under the dim light of flickering oil lamps. Cold draughts whispered through cracks in the walls, adding to the ward's oppressive atmosphere. The oil lamp's flame flickered, casting an amber glow over the rough-hewn stone walls. The nurse moved silently between beds, her ledger open to a fresh page. Each patient's shiver was noted with cold precision, their suffering reduced to clinical entries under harsh light. The antiseptic smell mingled with the stale air of the ward, creating an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down on every breath. Shadows danced along the walls, merging with the dim light. The cold draught whispered through the cracks in the stone walls, mingling with the acrid scent of antiseptic and unwashed bodies. Patients lay still on creaking beds, their forms barely visible beneath thin blankets. Each shudder was noted by the nurse's steady pen under the dim light of flickering oil lamps. Shadows danced along the cold stone walls, merging with the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down on every breath. The distant clatter of metal echoed through the ward, punctuating the silence. The nurse's ledger lay open beside her, her pen poised above a line of meticulous notes. Each patient's restless movements were met with a corresponding entry, their suffering reduced to cold statistics. Shadows pooled in corners, deepening the oppressive atmosphere. The antiseptic smell and unwashed bodies mingled, creating an air that seemed to suffocate under the dim light. The nurse's breath misted in the cold air as she moved between beds, her footsteps muffled by the thick stone floor. Each patient's shallow breathing was a testament to their silent suffering. The oil lamp cast long shadows that stretched across the room, merging with the dark corners where fear and despair lurked unseen. The antiseptic smell fought against the lingering odor of unwashed bodies, creating an atmosphere as oppressive as the heavy silence. The nurse's ledger lay open beside her, its pages filled with meticulous notes of each patient's suffering. Each shiver and muffled sigh was recorded with clinical precision under the amber glow of flickering oil lamps. Cold draughts whispered through cracks in the walls, mingling with the acrid tang of antiseptic and unwashed bodies. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on every breath, a heavy silence broken only by distant clatter and the nurse's steady pen. The nurse's footsteps echoed softly on the stone floor, each step a reminder of the cold, sterile environment. Shadows clung to corners as she moved, her oil lamp barely cutting through the gloom. Patients lay still in their beds, their faces pale and drawn under the flickering light. Each shiver and muffled groan was noted with clinical precision, reducing suffering to mere statistics on paper. The antiseptic smell fought against the lingering odor of unwashed bodies, creating an atmosphere as oppressive as the heavy silence. The distant clatter of metal broke the silence, echoing through the stone walls. Each patient lay still on their creaking beds, barely visible under thin blankets. Shadows danced along the cold stone floors as the nurse moved quietly between them. Her oil lamp cast long shadows that merged with the dark corners where fear and despair lurked unseen. The air was